Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi, and in this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the NFL Draft. Now, we're right in a perfect position between the start date of the draft, which is April 23rd, a little over a month away, and the end of the Combine. So we are in peak mock draft season, and we're still waiting on each college to hold their individual pro days in the weeks between now and the draft. But now that we have a lot more information on a lot of the top prospects, and there's generally a lot of buzz going on around them, why not take this time to dive into each prospect individually and break them down one by one? So it's easy to know where to start off with, obviously. The first pick goes to the Cincinnati Bengals. And there's no question that, at this point, there's no question that the top draft pick is already expected to be Joe Burrow out of Louisiana State, LSU. And just to recap his college career a little bit, even though Joe Burrow really doesn't need any introduction or any more credit put on his name, but just a quick recap, his ascent happened in a matter of months after transferring from Ohio State, where he spent the first 3 years of his college career. He went into 3 separate quarterback competitions and lost to the starters at the time, which were Cardale Jones, JT Barrett, and Dwayne Haskins. But he finished his year early, had 2 years left of eligibility, and used it to transfer as a grad student to LSU, where he then led the Tigers to a 25-3 record over his 2 years under center there. But we all know that his real claim to the spotlight came this past season when LSU went a perfect 15-0. He individually threw for 5,600 yards and 60 touchdowns, which is a single season touchdown record. That's absolutely ridiculous. He is said to have one of, if not the most impressive single quarterback season in college history. So what we watched from Joe Burrow last season was just as incredible as we thought when we were seeing it. And he has the numbers to back him up. He also has the awards to back him up, because he capped off his season with a Heisman Trophy, set a bunch of different SEC records, and probably the single best, we already talked about he has one of the single best years, but he also had one of the single best games for a quarterback in the Peach Bowl versus Oklahoma during the college football playoff. And that performance is still unmatched. And of course it was on LSU's way to a national title. So there are not a lot of criticisms that Joe Burrow gets. Obviously, one that he does get sometimes, just because, critics also need to point out not just the positive in a player, but also the negative, is that he definitely did have a very complete team at LSU, especially at wide receiver. He had top NFL talent at wideout at every skill position, and that's evidenced especially by this year's draft, because LSU is one of the schools that are losing a lot of players and a lot of starting players to this year's NFL draft. That includes wide receivers like Jamar Chase or Justin Jefferson or Terrace Marshall Jr. or Derek Dillon, or even Clyde Edwards-Helaire at running back. That was another skill position player that Burrow really was able to use to his advantage. And he was not only that, but he was also standing behind the nation's best offensive line, which won the Joe Moore Award for nation's best offensive line. And not to mention, obviously, Coach Ed Orgeron and the staff and playing system that they have in place, being one of the best, if not the best, in college football over the last couple seasons, and especially last season. So it's no wonder why LSU was able to succeed the way they did. And this success obviously was earned. But a few people like to point to that as a reason why maybe a lot of the attention Joe Burrow is getting should also be spread around to his teammates, which nobody is arguing against. But teams are only as good as their weakest link. And that definitely wasn't Joe Burrow, that's for sure. Not only was his team inspired by the Saints, but he has personally said that he's been inspired by the Saints offense, especially as a football fan growing up. He still is a fan of Drew Brees. He's been able to connect now as a prospect with Drew Brees and just talk about football. And we've been able to see that happen. So we can see where a lot of his influences come from, especially when you look at the way the Saints use play action. You can see a lot of that in the way Joe Burrow makes his decisions and under center and makes his own and kind of makes play action his own in the pocket. But not only was Burrow not the weakest link on his team, he personally led the nation in points responsible for at 26 per game, which may sound like nothing, or it may sound like, okay, well, a lot of offense around college football has been going up in recent years, and we've seen a lot more explosiveness. As a matter of fact, past percentages in the major conferences in college football were up 5% when they tracked it over the last decade. So it's not completely unexpected to see the kind of explosiveness that we were able to see. But even with that context being added, Burrow's accomplishments are still able to stand up as amazing amongst that group even. Not to mention that LSU also had the fifth toughest schedule of the season. So that on top of everything they were able to accomplish, which wasn't only the top of what we were able to see in comparison to their competition, but we were also able to see at the end of the day that it's top across the board in the history of college football. So that is definitely a credit that has been paid to Burrow, and he's definitely earned the spot as the number one prospect in this year's draft. But we didn't get to see him perform at the Combine, which he wasn't alone in that. A lot of other players also skipped the Combine just because there are some issues that prospects over the years have brought up about the way the Combine is conducted. Not necessarily that they have to participate, but they've brought up points that it's becoming increasingly dangerous, and the way it's organized is unfair to athletes, such as the vertical jump and broad jump and 40 events that we've seen and are televised. A lot of them don't take place back to back, and sometimes players can participate in one event at the beginning of the day and have a lot of cool off time where their bodies get cold, and then have to go at 10 p.m. and do a vertical jump. And a lot of players have expressed that as not being fair to their performance. Amongst that, like offensive linemen have pointed out, especially offensive linemen, that the fact that they conduct all of these drills without pads and some sort of equipment on, really doesn't allow them to be evaluated as fairly, for their complete set of skills as they would be seen on a football field. So you do see some years, especially this year, where some players just decide not to participate. And Clemson wide receiver T. Higgins was one of them. He just straight up said no, he was not going to participate. But we were still able to see a lot of major prospects do interviews and do media interviews. So we were able to hear a lot from them. And Joe Burrow specifically, he met with the Bengals, which obviously is the team that's projected to draft him. And apparently, according to all of the media that's come out about it, is that it went really well. And essentially, the Bengals' new offensive coordinator is already comparing him to the talent of Tom Brady. And during his interview at the Combine, he was being compared to Tom Brady. And obviously, that's a lot of pressure for any, young person that's trying to start a career being compared to the best person to ever do your job. But he did exhibit some confidence, and he was able to like put a stop to that right away and say that he doesn't want to be compared to Tom Brady, acknowledge all of the fact that it is a lot of pressure to put on somebody, and he handled it really well ultimately. But he's right that he shouldn't be compared to Tom Brady or compared to any established great, because he has to have the chance to establish his own career and his own path without having to compete with the image of expectations. But a lot of good qualities that scouts and coaches and specifically the Bengals offensive coordinator have pointed out that do add to his draft stock is that he does have a talent level that could be matched to Brady, and he has the preparation of a Peyton Manning, which is a killer combination that you don't always get to see in professionals, not even at the NFL level, not even at quarterback. So the fact that he can combine the physicality of the position, but also have a high football IQ and go out there and be prepared, and he's been documented saying that he goes out there and feels like he is the most prepared, and that's how he's able to be confident in his position and perform at the level that he knows he can. So if he's carrying that from college, that's already an advanced stance to have as a college quarterback. But if he's carrying that into the NFL, then he's already setting himself up for complete greatness. And honestly, barring injury, knock on wood, the sky is the limit for Joe Burrow, it looks like, based off of what we've already been able to see from him. But luckily, we got to hear a lot from him during that media session, and we got to hear a little bit more about where his head is and what he plans to do and where he sees himself. And one of those things that was good to hear from his mouth was how he straight up said that he would play for whatever team he's drafted for. He ended the speculation of could he say no if the Bengals drafted him and he decided he didn't want to play there, kind of like Eli Manning did with the 2004 drafts, where he forced a trade to the Giants with Phillip Rivers, a trade that we still are talking about to this day. It's still one of the most poignant drafts in NFL history. And if anybody could have pulled off a move like that in the modern NFL, it would have been Joe Burrow. But he's already put that rumor to bed. He wants to play for the love of the game, all that good stuff, and it's good to hear that come from him. But he is also looking a little bit beyond just the draft, and pointed out or made a note that he also wants the Bengals to try to keep wide receiver AJ Green, who's 32 years old this year. He missed all of last season due to injury. He missed part of the season before due to injury, and it's just not clear which AJ Green we're going to see if he gets back on the field. So it may not be the best idea for the Bengals to want to invest more in AJ Green, especially when they have a wide receiver on their team like Tyler Boyd, who's also a really good wide receiver option, and he's a lot younger, he's healthier, and he still has speed, and he's still he's the type of receiver that Joe Burrow would need, because he has the ability to track those balls, the deep balls that are being thrown. And with Burrow's accuracy and the talent, the kind of wide receiver talent that the Bengals could surround him with, kind of like how he was surrounded at LSU, could be best case scenario for a Bengals team that wants to pick up this quarterback and trying to transform their franchise. So we do have to wait until April 3rd, which is LSU's Pro Day, to see a little more about what Joe Burrow can do and what he can bring to the table. But we can talk a little bit more about the Bengals as well and how Joe Burrow would kind of fit on their team. Because they're definitely in the market for a new quarterback. That was made obvious last year with the performance of Andy Dalton. He got himself benched because he was playing horrendously. There's no way to sugarcoat that any more than that. And he's at 32 years old and having a less than a 60% completion percentage, and having a ratio of touchdowns to interceptions that's 16-14. And it's just not the kind of, it's not the kind of quarterback that you want to continue to build your team around. And the Bengals have realized that they're at that point after years of trying to make it work with Dalton. And now they're in a position, obviously, to, move on from that narrative completely. So, it's obviously not completely on Dalton. The offensive line that they put around him is also really trash, and he was sacked 37 times over the course of last season. Even though he missed a lot of games just from being benched before he was able to return. But they've been trying to trade Dalton away, it looks like. So we could possibly see a draft day trade situation happen when they pick Burrow. Maybe they'll try to move Dalton while they're at it for additional picks and maybe try to get him a young wide receiver that he can build a connection with and kind of grow with as young players. And in this draft, which is specific, especially deep at wide receiver, it's not out of the question, but it doesn't just come down to how they can make room for Joe Burrow on their team and how they can surround him so he can play to the best of his abilities. Because it also comes down to the way Burrow's able to adjust into the league and the way he's able to adapt. Because playing quarterback in the NFL is slightly different than college because anticipation and accuracy are so much more important over the long term versus just pure athleticism, which is good in Burrow's case because he has already been working on that. He's already proven that he can be a quarterback that is accurate. And he's already adapted to find ways to make up for, say his lack of pure arm strength by working on his timing and the way he is able to drop a football into a tight window and kind of anticipate where his receivers are going and the route that they're going to run based off of what's unfolding in front of him. So when you look at his adjusted completion percentage, which weighs completions by air yards and it excludes drops and throwaways, he sits at 82.5%, which is the highest mark in 9 years of tracking that stat from ESPN. And by comparison, other major conference starting quarterbacks over that same stretch of time recorded an average adjusted completion mark of just 67.7%. So Burrow's proved that he's up for that kind of challenge, specifically with the Bengals because they have such a unique case of trying to turn their franchise around after so many years. Being able to fit a quarterback like that with a special skill set that fits your specific needs, it just makes for a potential match made in heaven for this football combination. But there's still a lot to be seen when it comes to the actual draft and where and what actually ends up going down. So it's always fun to speculate, but we're not going to know. As Joe Burrow himself has said, there's no way to know until it happens. Now, we're going to take our first break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about one of the overall best prospects in the class, period. He just happens to play on the defensive side.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about Joe Burrow, the number 1 overall projected pick, and how he could possibly fit with his potential new team, the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, we're going to take a look on the defensive side of the ball and look at the player who a lot of people say would probably be the number 1 pick if Joe Burrow wasn't in this draft. In any other draft, he would be the player that we're talking about. And that player is Chase Young of Ohio State, pass rusher from Ohio State. And just to give a little background on how his Ohio State career went, since the beginning of 2018, all of his stats, important stats, are number 1 amongst his position. So he had 29 sacks, he had 81 hurries, and he had 131 pressures. And all of that came into the 2008 season when Nick Bosa, who was drafted last year by the San Francisco 49ers, was sidelined and preparing for his own draft. So Young saw his opportunity and definitely took advantage of it and emerged as the player that we now know him as. He finished his true sophomore season with 10.5 sacks, and then didn't stop there and took another step forward in 2019. So he set a school record at Ohio State with 16.5 sacks in only 10 games, missing 2 games for a suspension. He had 21 tackles for loss and 4 forced fumbles in 12 games. And all of that combined with the success that Ohio State was able to see in his tenure there. They won 3 Big Ten titles in a row. They earned a spot back in the college football playoff for the first time since 2016. And he individually was able to become an unanimous All-American and a Heisman finalist last year. Again, only losing out to Joe Burrow because he's in this class. And also, honestly, because the Heisman is really considered an offensive player and quarterback specifically player award first and foremost, with only 1 defensive player ever having won the Heisman, Charles Woodson from Michigan. So what he was able to prove is that can truly play flexibly and a positionless kind of game. He has freak level athleticism. He's a cerebral rusher with the kind of football IQ that we talked about with Joe Burrow, that he appears to save his best rushes for obvious passing situations. He's getting a lot of comparisons to Von Miller coming out of college as a dominant rusher who wins with his finesse. And it definitely takes more than 1 opponent to be able to block him and shut him down, truly shut him down. So just like the other star players, mostly at the top of the draft, he also skipped the combine, but he did do media sessions and medical testing, and pretty much gave us the part that we needed to hear, which is the personality side of him and how he really feels going into this draft. So he definitely made it very clear how he feels about himself. Take a listen.
Yeah, I definitely think I'm the best player in the draft. I think I showed it on my tape. You can go to every game. I think I showed it. I definitely think I put my best foot forward this year. I grinded hard. Two of my biggest things are hard work and dedication, and I'm gonna bring those 2 to the NFL with me.
Okay, so you heard him right there say that he has every plan to bring all of the intensity and all of the athleticism and everything we saw from him at Ohio State to the NFL. And he definitely looks like he can back that up, because everything that he said is also able to backed up, because everything that he said can be backed up by the stats that he's put up and by the effect that he's able to have on a team. And he's, as the single best player in the drafts, possibly, and as possibly the single best player in the draft, he's being compared to Jadeveon Clowney, Julius Peppers, Myles Garrett. So those things aren't really anything to sneeze at. So when you're getting attention like in that sense, that really shows you that it's a player to pay attention to. And they don't call him a generational talent for nothing. So we'll see more from him, hopefully, on Ohio State's Pro Day on March 25th. It'll be really interesting to kind of see what we didn't get from him at the combine, and just kind of see what shape he's currently in and what kind of shape that he's anticipating being in by the time the NFL season starts. But before we can get to that NFL season, we have to talk about the team that's expected to draft him at number 2, which is Washington. And it's kind of a perfect fit because he is from the DC area. He grew up in the Maryland suburbs, not too far. So it's kind of like he's ending up with his hometown team, which would be a nice narrative, but it's not even the best reason for Washington to draft him. Because honestly, the reason Washington should draft him is because he is the best player available on the board at the position that they're at. You know, like Washington doesn't necessarily need a pass rusher. It might not even be in their top 3 most important needs, honestly, because they were 10th in the league last season with 46 sacks. So it's not like they're specifically lacking at pass rusher. They also have Montez Sweat that they drafted last year. So it's not like it's their most important hole to fill. But when you have a player that's once in a generation like Chase Young, there is no way that you can give up on him or pass up on him unless they're thinking of trading the pick to another team. But there's no sign of that yet. So we're just going to base this off of what we already know. And based off of what we know, there's no way that Washington would be able to pass up defensive end like Chase Young. Who would be the number 1 pick, again, if it wasn't for Joe Burrow and the incredible year that he had that seemingly came out of nowhere. But on top of reuniting Chase Young with his hometown team, they could also possibly reunite him with his fellow Ohio State alum and quarterback Dwayne Haskins, who Washington also drafted last season. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of young core that Washington could form and kind of build their team off of, with Dwayne Haskins at quarterback and Montez Sweat lined up across from Chase Young, because that's how good he is. And Montez Sweat and himself isn't anything to sneeze at, because he also had 7 sacks in his set. Montez Sweat himself also isn't anything to sneeze at, because he also had 7 sacks in his first year in the NFL. So adding that kind of talent and shoring up that defensive line by putting Chase Young at defensive end or at outside linebacker, because he is able to shift and be flexible for you in the way that you need, could make all the difference on Washington's team. And it really could revive their franchise and send them in a different direction than the one they've been trying to get out of for the last couple decades, honestly. So having a rare defensive prospect with such an elite skill set like Chase Young, who can get in the face of any quarterback that's standing across from him without any limitations, without any major concerns about how he can function on the next level. The only thing that's being pointed out a little bit by scouts is that he kind of gives away his anticipation a little too much in his stance. If you can kind of tell which plays he's going to drop back on and which plays he's going to rush the passer on if you really look closely at his stance. So in the NFL, that might be something to take a look at and refine, just because that can make all the difference in an NFL game in a way that it wouldn't have in a college game. But outside of that minor concern, mostly he is a polished, powerful, athletic, defensive playmaker. And he, at this point, has every desirable trait. So we're going to take another break, but when we come back, we're going to stay on the defensive side, and we're going to take a look at who the Lions might be taking with their pick at number 3.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast, and we're still here talking about the upcoming NFL draft and where each prospect at this point is expected to go based off of the performances we saw at the NFL Combine not too long ago. So coming up next on our list at number 3 is the Detroit Lions, and there's already a lot of speculation with what the Lions are going to do at this position. A lot of mock draft boards have them trading with, say, the Chargers, for example, who are in the market for a quarterback. But a lot of other draft boards have them staying right where they're at and picking a quarterback themselves, shockingly enough. But based off of their need, the combine, and the information that we have right now, it's looking like they, if not will, should pick another Ohio State product, Jeff Okudah, at cornerback. And just to give a little background on Jeff Okudah, he became Ohio State's number 1 corner in 2018, and he had 32 tackles with 8 breakups. But just like Chase Young, he also took his game to another level in 2019, which basically all of Ohio State's team did, which is why they were able to make such a jump. And looking at the players, you can really understand why. He was by far the season's best defensive back. He was a shutdown corner who can dominate wide receivers. And that alone is a skill and a talent that can translate to the NFL so well. And as evidence of that he can pull that off on any level, he was targeted 54 times, but only allowed 1 touchdown. And also allowed a completion percentage of just 38.9%. So he definitely can prove himself to be a well-rounded prospect, which is a theme that we're starting to see a lot in not just this draft, but in college as a whole, because a lot of players are starting to prepare themselves that way to get to the next level. And a lot of players are in many sports, not even just football, are rounding out their game a little bit more so that they can be more of an asset to whatever team they end up on. And Okudah is probably a great case study of that, because he has this ability to be 2 different factors at once, and both of them are so essential to the way football is played. Because as a corner, it can be athletic, but he also has really fluid movement. He's really good at preventing separation between receivers and himself, because he can stay with wideouts with their speed and run the routes with them, but he can also get vertical and be able to break up passes, as we've been able to see. So he can do everything well across the board, essentially, and that makes Okudah indispensable when it comes to drafts, which is why just like Washington before them, Detroit really wouldn't be able to pass up a player like this, just because he is proving to be the best cornerback in this draft class, and he's really standing head and shoulders above the rest. His size and his physicality match up with big wideouts, which is so important, because we're seeing more and more in the NFL that wide receivers are getting more of the edge over cornerbacks, and it's increasingly becoming tougher to keep up with the speed of wide receivers and the size of wide receivers, and not even to mention wide receivers who are big and fast, like Julio Jones or DeAndre Hopkins. So that's definitely a sign to teams that he has the speed and the length to defend threats downfield. And he definitely did that at Ohio State. Now, he did participate at the Combine, which was lucky because it definitely helped him jump up to the spot of being projected at number 3. He definitely was able to make a name for himself, and not even just on the field, because off the field too, while in a Combine interview, he got kind of a suspicious question from a reporter, and he definitely gave an answer in the most confident way possible.
Sometimes you have a tendency to get kind of sloppy. How are you looking to kind of improve that?
Sloppy in what way?
Sloppy, like kind of penalties and stuff like that. Yes.
I had 0 pass interferences, 0 holdings, so cut the tape on again. I think you might see something else.
So yeah, you can hear Okudah there defending himself and definitely putting his stats on display. And that reporter actually ended up getting fired because of that question, which just goes to show how he could not have been further from the truth asking that of Okudah, because he has done everything to prove that he is the opposite of a sloppy cornerback who gives balls up. And matter of fact, he has been compared to the best defensive backs in the game. Jalen Ramsey, Tyrann Mathieu, Stephon Gilmore, the reigning defensive player of the year from this year for the New England Patriots, and Denzel Ward, which is most interesting because he's the Ohio State product that came out of their backfield before Jeff Okudah. So to see that Okudah is not even just on pace to match the names that I just named, but he's on pace to pass them, really just speaks volumes to the type of player that he is. And speaking of the Combine, he was able to do all of that. He was able to impress with his performance even after taking a really nasty fall and hitting his head and neck area. And he left the Combine for a little bit, but was able to return to the drills, and posted a 41-inch vertical. He ripped off a 4.48 second 40-yard dash later in the day. And that's only just the beginning from him, because we're also going to be able to see what else he can do at the Pro Day, Ohio State's Pro Day on March 25th. And it'll be nice to see what his performance will look like without the environment of the Combine specifically, and without getting hurt, because that makes a huge difference or that might have made a difference in what we were able to see from him. But more importantly, we know what he can do for the most part. So the real question is, what can he do for the Detroit Lions, which are still up in the air about really what they're going to do. There's no really consensus yet, and it's still a ways out from the draft, so it's no surprise. But there's also rumors that they're going to try and go for a quarterback into a Tonga Vailoa, and try to move current quarterback Matt Stafford. But obviously they've been having problems with that over the last few years, because his $30 million a year contract isn't really attractive to a lot of teams who are trying to move him. So, who are trying to look for a quarterback. So it doesn't seem like it's their likely plan. And Detroit is position needy across the board, because they are definitely a team that's had a rough couple of years. Like the two teams before Detroit on the board obviously also struggled last season. That's why they're picking so high. But Detroit has needed real talent at multiple positions for years now, and they haven't always drafted well, which is why a pick like Jeff Okudah would make such a huge difference to them. And they desperately need a cornerback opposite Darius Slay, who they aren't even sure will be back next year. So maybe they need a replacement for Darius Slay, who's going into a contract year and will be an unrestricted free agent after the season ends. Or they might even decide to trade him on draft night or before the season starts or some point during the season if they do go with Okudah. So a lot of what Detroit is going to do is still up in the air, but they honestly could not do any better with a pick like Jeff Okudah, because he's shown that he can be the exact kind of player that they need. since they were only able to get 7 interceptions last season, but they did give up a league worst 284 passing yards per game. So saying that Jeff Okudah is the fit that the Detroit Lions need makes a lot of sense at the number 3 pick. He's the type of shutdown corner that teams love, so there really is no hesitation if he's still on the board and they're not interested in trading the pick. Now it's time for another break, but when we get back, we're going to take a look on both sides of the ball because the next team has a couple different ways that they could go in this NFL draft.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And before the break, we were discussing the NFL draft upcoming in a little over a month on April 23rd, running through the April 25th. And so far, we've taken a look at the Cincinnati Bengals picking Joe Burrow first overall. We've looked at the Washington Redskins, who could take Chase Young at number 2. And we've taken a look at the Detroit Lions at number 3, who could do a couple things with that pick. But their best case fit would probably be Jeff Okudah. So that brings us to draft pick number 4, which goes to the New York Giants. And the New York Giants are a little bit interesting in this year's draft. Not that they haven't been in the last few drafts because they're also another struggling team, but they're an interesting pick at this. They're interesting at this pick because they, like the Lions, have a bunch of needs on many sides of the ball, and this is such a rich draft that they honestly have their pick of what they want to address first. So when you look at a lot of mock draft boards, there's going to be a little bit of a conflict between who people are anticipating them to take. One really good prospect would be Clemson's Isaiah Simmons at linebacker, who we talked a little bit about in the first episode, reviewing his combine. But looking at his college career a little bit, he could have entered this draft last year even if he had wanted to, but chose to return to Clemson. And it wouldn't have been a bad decision for him because last year he was also projected as a first or second round pick. But it seems that deciding to return for another year at Clemson was a good decision, which isn't always the case for every player, but for him it was a great decision because he was able to play himself into a top 5 pick, essentially, and not just a first or second rounder. Also, at Clemson, he was able to play multiple positions on defense, making him another really flexible defensive player, especially as a lineman, which is why he has caught the attention of so many scouts and so many teams, especially following the combine, because he was really able to put that on display. Even in college, he was able to play on both the line and in the secondary, which is the kind of player that not only teams are looking for, but specifically the Giants would be looking for because that fits their specific need as well. Even when he was asked, he described his own position as just defense. He didn't mark himself as at any one position. Even though positionless football hasn't necessarily been popular in the past, but he was able to execute it perfectly, effectively, and be as versatile as they needed him to be on defense. to the point where it's now considered an asset. And he himself also has been able to note the change in the way his position is played.
I think it's really beneficial for me because I know, like, years ago it wasn't good to be a positionless guy, but now it's became a benefit for me just for all the versatility that I'll be able to do, play linebacker, play safety, whatever it is. I feel like it just helps me out.
So, as you heard from Simmons himself, he was able to take what most people wouldn't have considered an asset and turn it into the reason why he is such a coveted draft pick today in this NFL draft. So looking back at his combine a little bit to kind of show what he exhibited there, he impressed all over and increased his draft stock for sure, definitely moving himself into the top 10, if not the top 5 for sure. And he blew scouts away with his 4.39 40-yard dash time, which was on par with running back times and Wisconsin's Jonathan Taylor, who had the fastest running back time. So for a linebacker who's 6'3" and 238 pounds to be able to move like that and show that he can move like that is basically unheard of, which is why he's been able to stand out so much. And he was just able to add on his 39-inch vertical to it, which was the fourth best, and an 11-foot broad jump, which was the second best amongst his position's performances. And honestly, the only comparable linebacker since 2006 has been the Seattle Seahawks' Shaquem Griffin, who is the only linebacker to run a faster 40-yard dash time at 4.38 back in 2018. So that kind of shows you where the yardstick is for Simmons' talent and how it's being measured, and how he's able to earn comparisons to players like DK Metcalf and his height, or the speed of Devin Hester, or the sturdiness of Roquan Smith, or even the hops of Julio Jones and the explosiveness of Alvin Kamara, which is incredible to compare a defensive lineman or a defensive linebacker to players like that, to offensive players who are skilled and fast and nifty and light on their feet. So for a big guy who's built the way he is at 6'3", 238, to be earning those comparisons really is an eye-opener and is really something that the Giants are intrigued by, especially at number 4. It's a really good chance that he's still going to be on the board at that position, and it's really up to them whether or not they're going to choose him. But we get to see a little bit more from Isaiah Simmons on his pro day on March 12th. So there's really honestly nothing else that he needs to show in order to prove himself more. He's done more than enough of that. And hopefully we'll just get a little more entertainment and a little more information, especially from teams as they get closer to the draft and get closer to deciding what needs they actually want to fill. So speaking of filling needs, for the Giants, Simmons would be a perfect fit for the new defensive scheme that the Giants are looking to deploy under their new defensive coordinator, Patrick Graham. Because they, especially not even just going forward, but in the last few seasons, it's been clear that the Giants need a little more flexibility on defense, and they need a playmaker. And the new scheme that they're trying to implement definitely requires a more versatile linebacker that can fill multiple roles at once, because the Giants won't be able to fill all of the holes that they have on defense. But with a player like Simmons, who already played 5 different defensive positions during one game in college, that's the kind of jack of all trades, one size fits all player that you never see in a draft. So that doesn't even include the free agent linebacker class that the Giants have to pick for. Apparently GM David Gettleman isn't that excited about the options that are out there, and for a good reason, especially when you're staring at a prospect like Simmons, who is definitely within your grasp. But the Giants have not seemed to have made a decision, because late last month, Gettleman put it out there that the Giants were open for business, kind of implying that they're open and talking about options for their pick. Not necessarily that they're deciding to trade it, but they're open to hearing options other than drafting at that pick, or possibly other than drafting Isaiah Simmons himself, drafting a defensive player. Although that did come out before Simmons had his monster performance at the Combine. So if we're going to look at a different direction that the Giants might go in, they also might take a look at offensive tackle Tristan Wirfs out of Iowa, who also put up another legendary performance at the Combine, especially for his position of offensive tackle. But before we get to that, a little bit of a background on him, because, offensive linemen don't necessarily get as much as the love and the attention that other position players get in football because they're more flashy. But Wirfs was definitely one of those offensive tackles that made an impact at Iowa that you were able to see a difference in, and immediately too, because he was the first true freshman to line up at any offensive tackle position, making 10 appearances and 8 starts in his freshman year, which is almost unheard of under his head coach, Kirk Ferentz, since he started in 1999. So that Wirfs is the first freshman tackle to start for Iowa in over 20 years. So if that isn't a difference-making player, even if it is at the position of offensive tackle, then nothing else is. And it's even more evidenced by the time he finished his career at Iowa, because he was second team All-American. He won Big Ten Offensive Lineman of the Year. In bowl games while he was at Iowa, they went unbeaten. They never lost. And he definitely made a difference at Iowa, being one of the biggest name stars on that team, which is different opposed to other teams that, put the main focus on the quarterback or on their wide receiver or even sometimes their running back. But Wirfs was able to really make a name for himself in a program and a position where it isn't really easy to do that. So that's just a testament to his talent. And the Combine is just further evidence of that. And he was really able to make a name for himself and put himself on the map with his 40 time, because it's actually faster than many of the tight ends in this draft class. And granted, this draft class isn't really going to be known for its tight end talent. If anything, that's probably the position that you don't want to have to draft in this year's draft. But still running at 4.58 in a 40-yard dash was the fastest amongst the offensive linemen, and like I mentioned, faster than most of the tight ends. So, just adding a 36.5-inch vertical and a 10-foot broad jump, which were both offensive line records, on top of what he already showed, just really showed that Wirfs is definitely worth the draft pick, or the high draft pick. And probably more, even what speaks to his specific talent even more, is the 3-cone drill, which a lot of people don't pay attention to in the when it comes to combine drills. But the 3-cone drill kind of shows how players are able to maintain their speed while changing directions. And for someone at his position, it's incredibly important for him to be able to do that. And he came in at 7.65 seconds in that 3-cone drill, which was 5th amongst offensive linemen. So standing in the top 5 of almost every stat that you can possibly put up during the Combine, on top of the career achievements you already had in college, is just speaking volumes to the talent that Wirfs would be able to bring to the Giants. And we might be able to get a little bit more of a glimpse at their pro day on March 23rd. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not any information on who's expected to draft him changes after that pro day, because honestly, it's just an opportunity for him to be able to show off even more of what he can do that he might not have gotten to do yet at the Combine, or he can capitalize off of the attention that he already got at the combine, and maybe even slide more firmly into that 4th draft spot, for the New York Giants. Because one of their priorities and why he'd be such a good fit in New York is because they are really focused on being able to protect the quarterback. They used a really high draft pick last year in the NFL draft on quarterback Daniel Jones. And last season, they got to deploy him a little bit and see the beginning of what his career could possibly be. So now they're going all in on Jones and his ability to be able to stay in the pocket and stay upright. So Wirf's ability to keep the quarterback upright and fill the need that the Giants are looking for makes him invaluable to their team. Because that is where they're putting all of their faith in, the ability for Daniel Jones to be their franchise quarterback. And for that to be able to happen and for him to be able to survive their offensive line, which has not been strong in years past and has led to, the downturn of their, it's been a part of the downturn of their franchise. Filling that need is the first step they would need to start seriously making changes that'll turn the franchise around. And they're very aware of that, and that's what the conflict between what needs to fill first comes in. But when it comes to comparing the two different picks and how they would better fill the need, it seems that even though Wirfs has strong hands and he has a very powerful base and low center of gravity, that helps him and plays well, and it helps him track down runners and end up with the tackle, and can be very strong and aggressive. Sometimes he can come off slightly underdeveloped because he has the ability to the habit of overextending himself and sometimes losing his balance and falling at times. And for the need that the Giants have to fill, it just seems like he ends up on the ground too much for the responsibility that he's going to have to take on right out of the gate, because the Giants are a team that are going to need whoever they draft first to immediately step into the lineup and make an impact. They aren't necessarily looking for players that they're going to have to develop or wait to catch up, not especially when it comes to this top pick in the draft. So it seems like he needs to develop his control a little bit. We might be able to see more of that at the Pro Day on March 23rd. But when it comes to comparing Simmons versus Wirfs for the Giants pick, it looks like Simmons is a little more of a developed prospect and would be able to fit into their lineup and make it a more immediate impact than Wirfs. But knowing that the Giants can go either way, it'll be interesting to see what they actually end up doing on draft day. Now, we're going to take another break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about one of the other biggest names in this draft and all the speculation that's surrounding him.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And now in our fifth segment, we're going to take a look at one of the biggest names, if not the biggest, most popular name in the 2020 NFL Draft. He needs no introduction, but we're talking about quarterback Tua Tagovailoa from Alabama. And the Miami Dolphins hold the number 5 pick, which is a perfect place for them because they are desperately searching for a quarterback. But before we get into all of that, he needs no introduction, he needs no recap, but let's look at his college career a little bit. Now, looking back, we know Tua is from Hawaii. He dominated the same high school as Tennessee quarterback Marcus Mariota, who then mentored him. And during his freshman season at Alabama, he started as a backup to quarterback Jalen Hurts, who was also in this draft, until the final game of the year, which is where he broke out onto the national stage, and that's where the legend of Tua really began. And we all know that it was the national championship game against Georgia. He replaced the struggling Hurts, who was benched by Nick Saban. And he then went 14 for 24, threw 166 yards and 3 touchdowns while running for 27 more yards, and then threw a 41-yard touchdown pass to Devontae Smith in overtime, which is what sealed another national championship for Alabama. Going into the next year, he was able to win the starting quarterback job over Jalen Hurts, and he was absolutely sensational. And the legend of Tua honestly just continued, and he had a nearly 70% completion rate for his passes, almost 4,000 yards with 43 touchdowns and just 6 interceptions. And he led them to yet another national championship game, but this time the title wasn't in the cards for them, and they lost to Clemson. But that did nothing to ruin Tua's reputation anyway. And in the following season, which was this past year, his 3rd year at Alabama, he topped a 70% completion rate at 71% and passed for 2,800 yards and 33 touchdowns with 2 rushing touchdowns on top of that and only 3 interceptions. So every season it just became clear that Tua was getting better and better. His flaws or his downsides in his game he worked on, and they became less and less of factors. He improved his accuracy. He improved his the connection with his receivers, which, you know, the chemistry obviously develops over time, but he was also able to just complete more passes to them. He was able to be more versatile in the pocket. And, obviously that all, was up until disaster struck in November against Mississippi State, where he suffered a dislocated hip after being tackled. That might have ended his career at Alabama, but it didn't necessarily end his potential NFL career after he decided to enter the draft. It really just, stirred up more speculation around Tua, and mainly because of his injury, because that's a dislocated hip, especially for a quarterback, especially for a mobile quarterback, can really be a devastating injury. So he obviously skipped out on the combine, like a lot of the other star prospects. And mostly the focus was on his medical reports and the kind of the progress that he was making in his recovery. Because his injury is so rare in football, it's not common, but the medical prognosis for Tua specifically, luckily, is that he'll make a full recovery and be able to resume football activities this spring, mainly starting with his pro day, which is he'll work out by himself on April 9th, even though Alabama's pro day is March 24th. And apparently he's already gotten the all clear to be able to work out, and that's a really good big relief, because there are a lot of, not a lot, but there are serious stories in NFL's past that give teams a little bit of concern when it comes to drafting Tua, not because of his potential, but because there's a question whether or not he'll be able to get on the field for a long period of time and live up to that potential. And one of the latest records that comes to mind and concerns teams the most is former Ravens tight end Dennis Pitta, who a few years back in 2013 dislocated his hip in training camp, but returned later that season and ended up dislocating his hip again in the beginning of the next season. So once that happened, the doctors told Pitta that it was not safe to continue to play football. But he still returned to the field in 2016. A year later, was able to post career highs and have a great season. but he dislocated his hip for the third time and he was done in 2017. So the concern is not necessarily whether or not if Tua gets back on the field, will he be able to, ball out the way we've seen him be able to ball out? The question is, how long will he be able to do that if he doesn't recover to the level that is comfortable enough for teams to be able to draft him? So luckily his 4-month checkup came out clean and he has been given green lights so far. That's good news for him. So if we can see him fully healthy at his pro day and he can show off that he can be the same Tua that everyone fell in love with watching him at Alabama, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not teams use that as a reason to take him at an earlier position. Like, there have been rumors of either the Dolphins or the Chargers trading up with Detroit, like we mentioned before, and taking Tua. And honestly, if it wasn't for this injury, we'd be talking about whether or not Tua or Joe Burrow should go number 1 overall. So that with Tua healthier than was originally anticipated, that question could kind of come back into play a little bit, whether or not Tua should be taken originally as high as teams wanted to take him. But we're going to have to wait until he has his solo workout to find that information out. But for right now, we can take a look at the Miami Dolphins, who hold the 5th pick and are desperately looking for a quarterback, and see what kind of role he could play for them. And since Tua has made such big strides in terms of his health, the good news is that there's no worry about another Dennis Pitta situation or even another Bo Jackson situation from a little further back where he ended up having to retire early and end his career early. So with that kind of concern on the back burner, Tua looks like he's already a great fit for the current NFL, and he looks like he could be a quality starter right out of the gate for the Miami Dolphins. He has proven that he can beat defenses in the pocket. He shows patience in the pocket. He doesn't get frazzled easily and throw the ball away or make errors. But he, at the same time, can also escape the pocket and make plays on his feet. And every year he's just gotten better and better at doing that, running for touchdowns himself, running for first downs himself. So as we've seen the NFL kind of trend in that direction following college players, we've seen players who get better and better at doing that who are coming into the NFL. And Tua definitely meets that definition. So that just goes to show how dangerous and game-changing he can be, because any throw he makes at any time when he draws back to pass could be a killer throw. It could be an aggressive play, especially in clutch moments where he needs to make them the most. That's when he plays his best ball. And you're not able to say that about every player, especially at the quarterback position, especially at such a young age, being a college aged student. But his talent is so far beyond his years, and his ability to pass downfield accurately and the fact that he has so much experience as a winner and knows what that winning culture is like and is bringing that into the next level has earned him a lot of admirable comparisons, and rightfully so. One of them being Seattle Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson, who plays a really similar game to what Tua has played and faced a lot of the same criticisms when it comes to size and height and hand size and durability that Tua is now facing. So to look at another player and how it could work in the NFL, a good example of that would be Russell Wilson. And based off of what we've seen from Tua, it could definitely even surpass that expectation. But scouts that are looking a little more closely could say that he might be able to improve slightly at increasing the speed of his release, and a little bit of reading his receivers a little better, which is more of a football IQ test, and his ability to connect with his receivers. And it's kind of a chemistry test as well, which he'll get a lot of in the NFL, and it'll be a real test to see if he can create chemistry with Miami receivers, or if which receivers they're gonna add to be able to create chemistry with Tua. But if he was able to work on his trigger a little faster and at certain moments be able to get the ball out of his hand faster. Even the smallest difference between seconds we've seen in the NFL can make a difference. And especially if he's trying to compensate for the injury that he suffered, that extra second could be the difference between him staying upright and him being on the ground and potentially suffering another injury. Especially coming from a left-handed thrower, which Tua is. So that in itself might take a little bit of adjusting to his receivers. And it's not really much to penalize him on. It's really just nitpicking details, but it does make a difference in how his career will play out, because that paired with Miami's weak offensive line in the past can really factor in to how successful he can possibly be in Miami. And Miami's going to have to take a look at securing his blind side with a really good solid right tackle. Otherwise, all of this could just be a moot point, and injury concerns would always be the case in Tua's career. So we're going to take one last break, and when we come back, it'll be fun to take a little look backwards in time and see which draft class was considered the best ever, since we're now experiencing another one of the best draft classes ever.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And now going to our last segment, we've covered the top 5 picks, the top 5 teams in the NFL draft, and the top 5 prospects that'll probably be picked by each of those teams. But how about we take a look back at a draft class that we already know how it turned out? And since it was called one of the best, if not the best, class of all time, especially for quarterbacks, it seems fitting that with 2 standout quarterbacks in this year's draft, we talk a little bit about the quarterbacks from the 1983 draft class. And 6 quarterbacks were taken by NFL teams in the first round of that draft, and that's a record that still stands today. So even though the popularity of quarterbacks obviously is still at the same height, it was really rare to see so many top-rated quarterbacks get picked all in the first round. And it's been a pretty famous draft in the years since, because obviously quarterbacks are difficult to project, and they don't always turn out the way that they are meant to develop. Not even every quarterback picked in this draft turned out living up to the expectation. But the 6 picked in the first round had a lot of successes between them, and 3 of them even ended up in the Hall of Fame. So let's take a little bit of a look at who those quarterbacks were. So the first overall quarterback taken was John Elway out of Stanford by the Baltimore Colts, which existed back then. And he was then traded immediately to the Denver Broncos. So Eli Manning isn't the first quarterback to demand a trade to a team that he'd rather play for after being picked first overall. And actually, John Elway at the time was a dual athlete playing football and baseball. So he kind of leveraged his potential baseball career to get what he wanted and get traded, which is, it's clever, but I don't really think that would fly too much nowadays anymore. But Elway, luckily for him, went on to have a Hall of Fame caliber career with the Broncos. He led them to 5 Super Bowl appearances, and he won back-to-back Super Bowls at the end of his career. So it obviously ended up working out for him and the Denver Broncos, and the teams that he was on, the teams that he was on went on to become legendary teams. So now John Elway, you can currently find him sitting in the box at Denver Broncos games still because he's currently their president and general manager. So moving on to the next quarterback that was picked, Todd Blackledge was picked 7th overall out of Penn State by Kansas City. And he was another one. He's one of those quarterbacks that didn't end up making a name for himself as much as was expected, but he did end up playing 7 seasons as a professional quarterback in the NFL. And he has worked as a college football analyst on ESPN now for many years. So NFL success doesn't always necessarily mean you won't find success afterwards. So that brings us to Jim Kelly, who was taken 14th overall out of Miami by the Buffalo Bills. And he is another name that you might recognize because he also went on to have more of a storied career, even though he initially refused to play in Buffalo. And instead, when the USFL was still a rival football league that existed, he spent the first couple of years of his career with the Houston Gamblers there. And he actually had tremendous success there, which is why he was able to kind of pull a little bit of a John Elway and kind of leverage that career. But he did end up staying in the USFL until 1986 when it folded. And then he finally went to join the Bills when he didn't really have much of an option as far as professional football leagues went. But he still went on to have a Hall of Fame NFL career in Buffalo, and made 4 straight Super Bowl appearances. Although the Buffalo Bills are infamous for going to those 4 straight Super Bowls and not winning a single one of them. But the legend of Jim Kelly still lives on, especially in Buffalo. And lately, you've been able to see him gain a lot of support for his personal struggle with oral cancer that he has battled over the last few years. And lately, there's been good news that has come out about his progress. So it's good to see Jim Kelly still in the recent spotlight. Now, the next quarterback who was taken has a little bit less of a known history, was Tony Eason, who's taken 15th overall by the New England Patriots out of Illinois. And some would definitely say that he is the least successful out of this group, but that's mostly because this group is so outstanding. He did manage to play 8 seasons as a professional football player. Most of them were with the Patriots. But he ended up ending his career with the New York Jets. And he has let's say it's a dubious distinction. It's kind of maybe a stat you don't want to be known for, but he's the only starting quarterback in Super Bowl history to fail to complete a single pass in the Super Bowl game itself. So maybe Tony Eason really doesn't want his name out there as much. And the fact that he was taken so highly and surrounded by such a quarterback class, it really didn't do wonders for his reputation after his career. But now the next quarterback up is Ken O'Brien, who's taken 24th out of UC Davis by the New York Jets. And he was another name that was, unfortunately overshadowed because of the names that came out of this draft. And even not even in hindsight, but he was also overshadowed at the time, heading into the draft, so much so that New York Jets fans, in classic Jets fans fashion, at the draft booed him when he was selected. And because they obviously preferred Dan Marino, who was a more well-known quarterback. They wanted, that star quarterback to come into their team, which is understandable, but it is the most Jets way to welcome in a draft pick ever. But he did manage to have a solid NFL career despite the way that he was drafted, or despite the circumstances surrounding his draft pick. And he played over 10 seasons in the NFL and threw for over 25,000 yards in his career, which is quite, those are both accomplishments, but it's not necessarily enough to outrun that initial reputation. So he stepped away from the game of football. And last known of him is he's currently working in financial management, but he has also dipped his toe back in football a little bit because he still tutors quarterbacks before drafts from time to time, including Super Bowl MVP Nick Foles. So it's interesting to see the impact that Ken O'Brien still has on the NFL without people really even knowing it. And last but not least, of the quarterbacks that were taken in that first round of the 1983 draft is Dan Marino, who was taken at number 27 out of Pittsburgh by the Miami Dolphins. So Dan Marino being the last quarterback taken in the first round was definitely a big story, and still is a big story given, all he's accomplished since then, and has been cited by Marino himself, as a moment that gave him a chip on his shoulder. It should have given him a chip on his shoulder, because his draft stock fell a little bit going into the draft because because of the senior season that he put up at Pitt, and there were rumors surrounding him, and some alleged recreational drug use. So to see even that his hometown Pittsburgh Steelers passed on him in the draft and just watch his name slide further and further down the draft board until he's picked at 27 is obviously a big point in NFL history, or a big storyline in NFL history. And it turned out to be a big mistake, as we know. And Marino went on to have a Hall of Fame career with the Miami Dolphins, including setting what were then NFL single season records for passing yards and touchdowns in only his second season as a pro. So fast forward to now, he has a notable media career outside of football. Has been an NFL analyst for CBS for several years. And he's even taken on more roles in the Dolphins front office. So Dan Marino definitely ended up making a name for himself, despite the way he started out, and rounded out the best quarterback first round draft class of all time. But there is an honorable mention that can't be overlooked from this draft class, even though he's not a quarterback, and that's Hall of Famer running back Eric Dickerson, who led the league 4 times in rushing, was a 6-time Pro Bowler, a 5-time All-Pro, and he rushed for an NFL record 2,105 yards in a season, and retired as the second all-time rusher with 13,259 yards. So Eric Dickerson is definitely a name that is also remembered from this draft. Maybe it gets a little bit cut out of the conversations when the focus turns to the quarterbacks, but the 1983 draft class is definitely considered one of the best for a reason. And this year has also garnered a lot of attention in terms of how deep the draft class is and how deep the talent also goes. And it's looking back, it shows you just how rare it is for draft classes like this to come together. So it'll be a really exciting NFL draft. And there are definitely more prospects to take a look at as we continue to get closer to April 23rd. But thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network, from football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.